Hi, Dr. Pulsifer here, and I'm going to talk about some common myths about gamers and games. Much of the conventional wisdom about games, as seen from outside the gaming hobby, is wrong. And sometimes people inside the gaming hobby see things wrong as well. We're talking here about video games and tabletop games, and sometimes something is true of one type but not of the other type. We're not talking about sports or about games that are merely a way to organize play. The word game is used very broadly, and we're trying to use it more narrowly. So there's not a particular order to these. We'll just go through some of these myths. And one that's very old and very out of date is games are for kids. Well, to quote a video game industry document, already 62% of the console market and 60% of the PC, 66% of the PC market is age 18 or older. The game industry caters to adult tastes, unquote. Certainly, it's rare to see a child playing a typical hobby game. Another myth, everyone plays to win. Well, that's not even close. There are many other reasons to play, and this has been shown by survey, including a book on the topic, and certainly by citation of many individual examples. For example, one of my students once said his brother played to help other people win. That's kind of extreme, but that's not unusual. Another myth, everybody plays games. Well, there was a time when not very many people played games, and now there's a time when many people play games, but still, lots of older people and some young ones do not play games. Some people just don't have any interest. My brother-in-law loves technology, but plays neither video nor tabletop games. Now, there are a lot of myths about design, which I'm trying to encapsulate in a few slides here. The first one is making games is much like playing games. Well, in fact, especially in video games, there is almost no similarity between the two. Playing video games involves persistence and there's little possibility of failure. Game design must be done in a timely manner and has the possibility of failure, in fact, quite frequently. Video games are frequently involving athletic skills, whereas game design is about critical thinking, two very different kinds of skills. Problem solving has mostly been removed from video games. It's the primary activity in game design. Now, on the tabletop side, problem solving is much more common in tabletop games, although it's becoming less common. There's still not much in the way of athletic skills in tabletop games. Another myth, game creation equals computer programming. Well, of course, that's not true of tabletop games because there's no software involved in almost all cases. Video games are software, but design and programming are very different things. And of course, many programmers are wannabe designers. And of course, in very early days, one person was both designer and programmer, but that's not true anymore. Computer programming is a necessary evil that has to be done in order to make a game, a video game. Now, to go back to more typical myths, gamers are misogynist troglodytes. Unfortunately, many and the most vocal still are, but most are not. And a large proportion, though not a majority, of players are women or girls. They're not likely to be misogynists, which is people who hate women. Another myth, you can gamify anything. Well, you can scoreify a great many things, but keeping score doesn't make an activity a game. Fortunately, the whole fad of gamification has moved out of the limelight. Another myth, games are complicated. Well, lots of games are complicated, but lots of other games are simple, and there are lots of games in between. And there's so many thousands of games that you can find hundreds that satisfy whatever level of complication you want. There is one unavoidable complication to tabletop games. Someone has to read and understand the rules. Another myth, games are all about shooting and blowing stuff up. Well, that's very definitely not true of tabletop games, but even in video games, the games about shooting and blowing stuff up are just the hardcore. And those are the ones that are heavily marketed because so many are targeted to the same group. And because those games are so expensive to make at $50 or $100 million or even more, they have to sell enormous numbers to break even, so they have to talk about it a lot and have people learn about it. Another myth, girls don't play games. Well, I met my wife via D&D back in 1977, and female gamers were unusual then. Now they are nearly half the players of the younger adult ages. Another myth, games are like puzzles. Well, kinda, but in general, puzzles are like puzzles, and many things we call games are actually puzzles. A single player game, whether it's video or tabletop, is generally a puzzle. The card game Solitaire is a puzzle. Tetris is a puzzle with time stress added to make it harder. Chess and checkers are puzzles that are too complex for humans to solve. Another myth, games are all about math. Well, sometimes, especially in the puzzles that we call games, that may be true, but it depends. Many games are about reading the other player's intentions rather than math, and you could say games are about people. That's generally more likely tabletop games because you have more people involved in most cases. And of course, some people say games are about stories, which are kind of the opposite of math. A myth that games are about dice. Well, just because some traditional board games use dice or spinners doesn't mean all board games need to use dice. And of course, we can go back to chess and checkers and many other traditional or classic games that don't use dice. What we call games, again, they're probably puzzles. Card games don't use dice. Many video games don't use any equivalent of dice. In other words, the software isn't rolling dice in the background. And in fact, many game players dislike dice, though the same people will often accept a different means of randomization, such as cards or drawing from a bag, but this is more common in tabletop games than video games. Probably one of the biggest myths of all is new games are usually better than old ones. Well, games have changed over time because preferences have changed, but not because the design is any better technically. Now, in video games, the technology has improved a great deal, and that makes a big difference. In tabletop games, the technology has hardly improved at all, of course, and so it's a different situation. Where there isn't definite and prolonged improvement, and there isn't technology, the best of the new is unlikely to be better than the best of the old, and I will make a separate video about that. Now, violence is a place where the myths are not quite myths. Games are violent. Or rather, the video games, the big ones that I talked about before, the AAA list ones, are violent. But most video games, in terms of numbers, in terms of number of players, are not violent. But the violent ones get a lot of attention. And of course, there's little feel of violence in tabletop games. But in AAA list video games and many other video games, the depiction of violent death is all too common. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and some applies only to one type of game, such as video or tabletop. Thanks for listening.